Well, Nando, one other thing that needs to be resolved is these people who dodge their taxes, these tax havens. What are we going to do? What are we going to do about it?
Well, hopefully we can tax them. Back in 2017, Donald Trump slashed the American corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. This obviously made business people very, very happy. They'd been complaining for years that the 35% rate was way too high and that it made U.S. firms uncompetitive in the global market. This was, of course, always a bunch of gobbledygook. Because of the presence of many tax loopholes, few businesses actually paid that 35% rate. And in terms of competitiveness, I mean, just look at the top companies in the S&P 500. U.S. firms are doing fine. Now, President Biden is proposing to raise that rate back up to 28% in order to pay for his big infrastructure bill. Now, it's still below the 35% it was before 2017, but if they do it in a way that closes a lot of those loopholes, the effective rate may be higher. But in the wake of that proposal, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen called for something very, very interesting, something that certainly piqued my interest: a global minimum corporate tax.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has called for a global minimum tax rate. The goal, getting other countries on board in order to prevent offshoring. This is a tax rate for corporations. Let's listen.
Competitiveness is about more than how U.S. headquartered companies fare against other companies in global merger and acquisition bids. It's about making sure that governments have stable tax systems that raise sufficient revenue to invest in essential public goods and respond to crises.
Now, if implemented, a global minimum corporate tax would probably be the most significant reordering of the world economic system since the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944. It is an idea that Thomas Piketty has been calling for since his book, Capital in the 21st Century, burst onto the scene in 2013 and changed the way a lot of people thought about inequality.
When you are in a situation where the largest multinational corporation in the world sometimes pay a lower effective tax rate than the small and medium-sized businesses, this is not good for anyone. Well, this is good maybe for them, but for the economy, it's not good. And, if the middle class feels that they are paying more than the very rich, this is not good, because at some point later on down the road, if you want support for globalization, it's important that broad groups in the population feel that they are benefiting from it. You cannot have just such a big fraction of the gains going to such a small group. So you want more transparency about who pays what.
Right.
And for this, you don't need a global government, but you certainly need more global cooperation, more automatic exchange of information between countries about cross-border financial assets, so that we have an equitable tax system which allows government to invest in public infrastructure.
This is not good. This is very not good. Now, when I was at Fusion, we were one of the news organizations that partnered to publish the Panama Papers leaks back in 2016. It was an incredible trove of information that showed just how staggering the offshoring of wealth really was.
A new report says that at least $21 trillion is being held around the world in what are known as offshore accounts or tax havens. Now that is $21,000 billion, 21 followed by 12 noughts, as you can see there. It is as much money as the entire annual economic outputs of the US and Japan combined.
Yeah, $1 trillion really is a lot of money. It's like 1,000 billions. This is a lot of money. Now, estimates today say that the actual amount of money hidden in offshore bank accounts could be as high as $32 trillion. I mean, just think of what we could do with all that money. Now, this problem has really gotten way out of hand during the neoliberal era, as financialization and globalization have made it easy for corporations and the wealthy to move vast sums of money around the world with just a couple of clicks of the mouse. What has happened is that because corporations are able to move around very easily while countries are fixed in place, it creates an incentive for countries to lower their rates in order to attract investment, thus creating a race to the bottom. According to a study by economists Emmanuel Saez, Gabriel Zuckman, and Kimberly Clausing, Quote, international tax competition and profit shifting have led to a large decline in effective corporate tax rates. Between 1985 and 2020, the global average statutory corporate tax rate has fallen from 49% to 23%. In the United States, the average effective tax rate on corporate profits has fallen from close to 50% in the 1950s to 17% in 2018. Multinational companies also shift paper profits between their various subsidiaries, including subsidiaries incorporated in offshore tax havens with zero or close to zero rates. As a consequence, there is increasing concern about corporate tax base erosion due to such profit shifting. The scale of this problem is quite large. As one example, in 2017 data for U.S. multinational companies, they report offshore accumulated earnings of $4.2 trillion, $3 trillion of which was in tax havens. And perhaps the most famous example of this kind of corporate tax avoidance has been Google, the host platform of this very program, who for years has been doing something called the double Irish to avoid paying taxes. Now, what is the double Irish, you say? Well, it's a lot less fun than it sounds. This is from the Irish Times. Quote, it's best described as a loophole or a quirk in the Irish tax code that allows companies to incorporate or set up here while remaining tax resident elsewhere. It meant Google and other companies could place their intellectual property patents in subsidiaries that were legally based in the Republic but not treated as being domiciled here for tax purposes. Instead, these companies put their IP in vehicles located in tax havens such as the Cayman Islands or Bermuda, where companies pay no income tax. This allowed them to channel billions of euros of profits through Ireland and onto Irish incorporated entities elsewhere, avoiding tax on a grand scale. You know, the internet search giant Google has been using this double Irish to funnel billions in corporate profits through Ireland and onto Google Ireland Holdings, the parent company for Google Ireland, which is located in Bermuda, effectively putting them beyond the reach of U.S. tax authorities. Google Ireland Holdings recorded $14.5 billion in untaxed profits in 2017 on turnover of $22.3 billion, while having zero staff on its books. But Google is not the only offender. According to Ryan Cooper in The Week, between 1980 and today, the percentage of foreign profits booked by U.S.-based multinational corporations in tax havens has tripled from less than 20% to almost 60%. There is no sign of the trend stopping either. In 2020 alone, 9 countries cut their corporate rate. Now, as you would expect, the business community is none too pleased with the new proposed tax plan.
The opposition to higher taxes from the business community is almost unanimous. 98% of the CEOs surveyed by the Business Roundtable said raising the rate from 21 to 28% would have a moderate to very significant impact on competitiveness. 75% said it would dampen investment and innovation, and 71% said it would hurt their ability to hire. Now, those survey results just came out today, and in a statement, Raytheon CEO Greg Hayes said keeping competitive tax policies in place is needed to help reinvigorate the U.S. economy and lead to more opportunities for Americans, especially after the pandemic. Now, Raytheon has projected it would have to pay an additional $1 billion under Biden's tax plan, and it warned it may slash R&D spending by 20%.
Now, a good rule of thumb is if the Raytheon CEO doesn't like something, it's probably a really good thing. Now, specifically with regards to the global minimum corporate tax, Foreign Policy magazine ran a funny op-ed by a guy named John Sullivan, who was a special advisor to the chairman and staff economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors during the Trump administration. John Sullivan wrote, quote, in the unlikely event that Yellen's plan succeeds, one winner would be China. Ever since he was a provincial official, Chinese President Xi Jinping has viewed corporate taxation as part of how China competes with other countries. If rich democracies in the OECD tie their hands on corporate taxes, they'll be handing China, which is not an OECD member and unlikely to adopt the proposal, an opportunity to use tax rates and breaks to lure even more investment into China. This would directly undermine the Biden administration's stated goals on diversifying supply chains and containing Chinese power. In the more likely event that the administration's global corporate tax plan fails, the embarrassment thus created would hand propaganda points to Russia. Propaganda points. That's a new one I've heard. If the Biden administration's global minimum tax fails, it'll fail after Western democracies have spent at least several months arguing it's a solution for reducing global inequality. Russia, perhaps by weaponizing information on tax evasion by wealthy Westerners that's collected by its security services, will be all too happy to remind the world how U.S.-led multilateralism floundered at the attempt to stem all that inequality. Oh no, not more propaganda points for Russia. You gotta love that kind of op-ed. I mean, it just puts a smile on my face. Now, President Biden has dismissed critics of the plan in the most Biden possible way by saying, quote, you have 51 or 52 corporations of the Fortune 500 that haven't paid a single penny in taxes for 3 years, he said. Come on, man. Let's get real. Now, the global minimum corporate tax, if handled correctly, would make this kind of scheme impossible. And beyond the actual tax revenue that it would raise, which is significant, on a more fundamental level, it would shift the balance of power between corporations and governments, which, you know, in theory, are accountable to us, the people. If governments don't work together, then corporations can exploit that competition between states for their own benefits. If states have some level of cooperation, they can avoid the race to the bottom, which has been occurring for decades.
You know, the one thing that I wonder about this plan is what happens if you have one state that decides, no, we're going to offer a lower rate. You know,
that's always, yeah, I mean, that's always possible, obviously, but if it's one of those things where like the U.S. and the rich world, the powerful world, the powerful countries, exert their power on all kinds of other things. Like they can put pressure on the Cayman Islands, to play ball by, threatening sanctions or things like that. Like I'm not going to advocate like threatening, bombing them or something, but like there are ways that the rich countries can coerce countries to do this, and there's also ways that they could just on the other end, that they can penalize corporations who engage in this kind of thing. Like if say one country doesn't play ball, then you can just say like, well, anyone who does business with that, like any corporation that sort of settles, their headquarters there or whatever, in that country, like will just, you can't do business in the United States, or you'll get a massive tax penalty or something like that. Like there's just a million ways to exert pressure if they really wanted to. The United States influences local laws all over the place for various nefarious things. They could pressure these kind of tiny countries if they really, really wanted to. So yeah, I mean, it's probably one of these things that's going to take a long time. It's not going to happen overnight. I mean, I do find it interesting that within the Democratic Party, the co-sponsors for this kind of bill in the Senate have been Ron Wyden, who's good on a number of issues, Sherrod Brown, which is not very surprising, but also Mark Warner from Virginia, who is, I believe, still, if not the richest senator, one of the richest senators, and generally like one of the most conservative Democrats. I mean, people know about Joe Manchin, but Mark Warner is not too far behind. So yeah, it's been an interesting kind of development. I did not expect it. It was not in the conversation in any way. I mean, it's been kind of kicked around in certain policy circles for a while, but it wasn't like a campaign issue or anything like that. But it's something that needs to happen desperately. And I think that maybe in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, when governments have become very, very desperate for any kind of tax revenue at this point, like their tax bases collapsed with the sort of economic stoppage caused by the pandemic. Like it may be the reason why, the United States and the EU are thinking about implementing something like this.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I get a little pessimistic, especially when it comes to people like Janet Yellen, who, was not the greatest when she was the head of the Federal Reserve. But the Federal Reserve has all sorts of problems with or without Janet Yellen. And keep in mind, like, she was paid $11 million in just a short time span, 2 years, to just give speeches on Wall Street. I mention that because the very people who would be impacted by this global tax, this global minimum tax, are the very people who have, paid her bills in the past. So there needs to be like a will to fight for this, and I'm pessimistic on that, but I do agree that it's a good proposal.